This week we are continuing our discussion about the evolution of the sonnet form in English. And so last week we talked about the early English sonnet writers, Wyatt and Surrey, and how they were borrowing from the tradition of the Italian Petrarch, formally and conventionally. Moving on to Sir Philip Sidney, who starts to kind of depart from convention and tradition and do some innovation in terms of form and meter and rhyme scheme. This week we're talking about Shakespeare's sonnets. He perfected the English sonnet, which is also known as the Shakespeare sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet. And so we can't really talk about the evolution of the sonnet form without talking about Shakespeare. As I noted in the introduction, there are a total of 154 sonnets written by Shakespeare, and I asked you to read a handful of those. The sonnets are unique in that there are two objects, or two love objects, addressed in the sonnets. The first 126 sonnets were addressed to a young man, and sonnets number 126 to 154 are addressed to what's known as the Dark Mistress, of Shakespeare's Dark Mistress. And then there are several sonnets, namely 40, 42, 144, and 152, in which both the young man and the Dark Mistress seem to appear or seem to be addressed by the speaker. So for the discussion forum this week, I've divided the class into small groups and assigned one of the sonnets to each group. And I'm asking you to explicate them following the guidelines that you're going to see on the second midterm. I've selected 4 sonnets from that group that I'm going to model for you. And 2 of the sonnets were addressed to the young man, and 2 of them are addressed to the Dark Mistress. As I noted in the introduction, in 1640, when the sonnets were published without Shakespeare's permission or awareness, the publisher changed the male pronouns he and him in the first 126 sonnets addressing the young man to she and her. And so, as I noted, Shakespeare probably intended for these sonnets to be read by his friends and not by the public. It would have been controversial, this expression of passion or desire for a young man. The sonnets addressed to the Dark Mistress are much more sexual. The sonnets addressed to the young man are much more platonic, and you can tell that the speaker is being very careful. And this is a good example, Sonnet 20. I think it would have been a little bit confusing to the people who are reading the sonnets in 1640, given that they really wouldn't understand what the problem was that's presented here in Sonnet 20, which is that the speaker is attracted to a young man. I'm going to read through the sonnet, and then we'll break it down stanza by stanza. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as is false woman's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false in rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. So the first thing you're asked to do is to scan the poem and to look at the meter and the rhyme scheme. And you'll find in Shakespeare that it's almost always this rhyme scheme: A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. And it's almost always perfect iambic pentameter. And when it's remarkable is when it deviates from that form. And so there's usually a point or a purpose to that. There were some questions about rhyme scheme, and I just wanted to clarify how that works. So when you're trying in the rhyme scheme, you don't even have to read the poem, actually. You just have to look at the last word of each line. And then alphabetically, you assign a letter starting with A to each new sound that's presented. And so in this case, painted is the first word, so we would assign that A. Passion, it doesn't rhyme with painted, so we give that a new letter, B. Acquainted does rhyme with painted, so now we're back to A again. Fashion rhymes with passion, and so we're back to be. And then we have a new sound, rolling, and you can see it rhymes with controlling, right? And then gazeth and amazeth. And so this is how you assign a letter to each word at the end of the line. And like I said, A B A B, C D C D, E F E F G G is almost always Shakespeare. What's unique in this case, I've divided the first line up into feet. And remember, a foot is 2 syllables. And you can see that it's almost perfectly iambic, but there are 11 syllables. And that's not uncommon. It's very difficult to make a perfectly iambic line that is in pentameter. And so a lot of times writers will contract a word or shorten a word or do something to try to make it 10 syllables, but sometimes it goes over by 1. And so it's iambic pentameter with variation. But if you look at each line in this particular sonnet, you'll notice that it's 11 in every single line. So that is very odd. And we're going to come back to that because every choice in Shakespeare is deliberate. Every detail is deliberate. And so you want to think about why. Why is there 1 extra syllable in each line? And it's part of kind of the joke and the pun that Shakespeare is presenting here. So I want to break it down 1 quatrain at a time. So a quatrain is the 4-line stanza AB here, and just sort of break it down this way. And you see as you move through the poem, the speaker is flattering the young man, but at the same time he's presenting some pretty unflattering generalizations about women. And so the first line, a woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou the master mistress of my passion. And so nature is personified. That happens a lot in Shakespeare. And she's a creator. And she's given him the aspect of a woman's face. And so he's the master mistress of his passion. He has the aspect of a female, but he's male. And so he combines both of these qualities, paradoxically. And the use of the word passion is significant. It's, like I said, the sonnets addressed to the young man aren't explicitly sexual, but you do get a sense of unsatisfied longing in some of these, and this is a good example of that. He goes on to say that you have a woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change as is false woman's fashion. And so on the positive side, you have the gentle nature of a female, but you're not fickle, which is shifting change as is false woman's fashion. And so you remain faithful. And so again, this is one of those not so flattering generalizations that Shakespeare is making about women. So now I'm going to move on to the second quatrain. An eye more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And so again, he's talking about the young man's eyes, and it's conventional to talk about their brightness. If you think back to Petrarch, right? His are brighter than a woman's eyes and less false and rolling and looking, elsewhere, right? So again, suggesting his fidelity or his faithfulness. And everything he looks on, he makes it golden, right? Gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. This is interesting. A man in hue, all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And so I'm drawing attention to the word hue here because I think Shakespeare is employing a pun. He's referring to the secondary definition of the word hue, H-U-E, which refers to character or aspect, right? A hue is a color, but the secondary meaning is character or aspect. So he has the aspect of a man in hue, and all hues in his controlling, suggesting that he controls all hues, so all aspects. And this is kind of reinforced in the next line, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. So he's attractive to both men and women. But the idea that he has all hues in his controlling, I think Shakespeare's playing on the homonym word hue, H-E-W, which means to cut primarily, but again, the secondary form of the word is to conform or adhere to, which suggests a kind of performance, right? So all hues in his controlling. And so maybe what Shakespeare is saying here is that he has the ability to perform gender, right? To be male or female in aspect. And so moving on to the last quatrain, and for a woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing. And so the syntax is interesting here, but the first line is pretty obvious. And for a woman wert thou first created. So when nature began her project, you were intended to be a woman. But then nature, personified again, she fell a doting. As she created you, she fell in love, right? And then by addition me of thee defeated. And so he's been defeated because nature's added something. By adding one thing to my purpose nothing. So she added one thing, she gave you one thing that is to my purpose nothing, not for my use, not something that I can use. And then moving on to the final couplet, right, where he presents the solution. But since she pricked thee out for woman's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. And so, there's a pun here on the word pricked. What she's given him is a penis, right? Since she pricked thee out for a woman's pleasure. This is the one thing that is to his purpose nothing. Mine be thy love, and thy love's use their treasure. So what is his solution? Mine be thy love, so give me your love, right? And thy love's use their treasure. And so in other words, give them your body, your physical love, but give me your, spiritual or platonic love is presumably the implication here. So now we come back to the question of what's going on with this extra syllable. We've seen a pentameter line, we've seen a hexameter line. It always has to be even in terms of the metrical foot, right? 2 syllables make up a foot. But we have this extra syllable here, and I think that this is deliberate as part of Shakespeare's joke in a way. It would have been distracting to anyone familiar with the form and, the precision with which he crafted the form, this extra syllable on every line. And I think that that's part of his own distraction that he's reinforcing for the reader, right? This one thing that's added to his purpose nothing. And so again, we have this one thing added, and it's kind of a distracting thing, and it's a frustrating thing if you're trying to figure out why it's there. And so perhaps that's part of his joke. And he added that one little thing there to kind of reinforce the way that he's feeling about the young man. So moving on to Sonnet 60, the second sonnet that's addressed to the young man. And it's not really about the young man at all, really. It's more of a meditation on the passage of time and mortality. And it reads, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Each changing place with that which goes before, in sequent toil all forwards do contend. Nativity once in the main of light crawls to maturity, wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses gainst his glory fight, and time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands before his scythe to mow. And yet in times and hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. So if we start with the formal aspects, the meter and the rhyme, in a typical Shakespearean, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And it's perfectly pentameter. There's 10 beats in every line, and it's mostly iambic. And so it doesn't really deviate formally, but Shakespeare is introducing a really sort of subtle formal feature here in the syntax and the diction of the line as a way of reinforcing what he's saying. And so we start with a simile, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. He's comparing waves slowly approaching the shore to our minutes, coming, the minutes of our life passing slowly until they reach an end. And so you think, well, when the wave crashes on the shore is at the end. In the second group of lines, he's talking about sequent toil, the sense of things repeating, a pattern of repetition, each changing place, which with that which goes before. And that's what happens with a wave, right? It slowly moves towards the shore, and then it seems like it really quickly retreats, and then we have another slow movement towards the shore. And within this first stanza, he's repeating that rhythm. You have this long line, which represents the slow movement of crawling towards the shore, and then this quick line representing the retreat of the wave. And so when the wave crashes, it's really sort of like the beginning of the end. And when that happens, things speed up. So we sort of slowly move towards the shore and then like quickly move towards our death is kind of the pattern that he's presenting here. This idea that in sequent toil all forwards do contend, right? Even just the words suggest that there's a sort of slow movement towards the beginning of the end, which he then repeats in the next group of lines. So moving to the second quatrain, it reads, "Nativity once in the main of light, crawls to maturity wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses gainst his glory fight, and time that gave doth now his gift confound." And it's almost like a reversal in terms of the length of the line here. It's like we've reversed what's happening up here. But he's repeating this motif, right? Nativity, so this refers to birth, right? Once in the main of light. And so the broad expanse of light, we're born into this light. And the word crawls, I think, is significant because babies crawl, right? Crawls to maturity. It's a slow movement. It's a progress, right? Wherewith being crowned. And we think of when you're crowned, right? You're made sovereign. You're at the highest point that you can be. And then immediately, crooked eclipses gainst his glory fight. So you crawl to this point, this moment, this glory, and then immediately you're dimmed. This is the sense of an eclipse, something that covers the sun, obscures the brightness, covers the light, but it does it slowly, right? It moves over the face until it's completely blacked out. And the diction is not appealing at all. Crooked eclipses, right? We could talk about what that means. And time personified here. When time is personified in Shakespeare, it's never a good thing. Time takes his gift away. And so we have a repetition of the idea of what's happening up here. Slow movement towards maturity. You reach your peak, and then a quick movement in the opposite direction towards the end. And then the final quatrain, again, time personified. Time does transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And so he's developing an agricultural metaphor here. And so time kind of destroys the flourish set on youth, and this idea of delving parallels in beauty's brow. And this is sort of like drawing the tracks in a field, right, so that you can plant things to grow, right? Feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands before its scythe to mow. And so what happens is when you plant a crop, it grows to maturity, right? And then it gets cut down. And so this is the metaphor that's being used to describe the progress of life. We plant, we sow, and then we age, delving the parallels in beauty's brow. This is, the tracks in the ground, but it's also the wrinkles in our face, right? And this sense of time is feeding on the living, I think is interesting, like devouring life in a way. And then, we have the image of the kind of grim reaper with his scythe cutting everything down. So the problem that Shakespeare presents here is the problem of time and mortality. And the solution he presents in the couplet, "And yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand." The concluding lines are interesting. It seems to say, that you'll be immortalized in verse. But he hasn't really been praising anyone in this particular sonnet. You get more of a sense that it's a meditation on his own mortality. In some of the sonnets, he talks about his mistress deceiving him and lying to him and telling him he's young, and they're sort of cooperating in this lie. So you get a sense that perhaps he's approaching middle age, and maybe the young man is to Shakespeare representing to himself this moment when he was crowned, right, when he was at his peak. And so he in presenting the solution, it's a solution for both of them in a way, right? And so the verse endures, and it's a reflection of him and his glory. It's also a testament to the young man insofar as he's praising him and praising his worth. And we could talk about what that is. Is it beauty? Is it these things that he seems to be concerned about, or is it something else? And the other kind of conundrum is, he had not intended his verse for publication, and so what happens when you don't publish something? Does it endure in the way that he imagines here? And so it opens up more than just a sort of simplistic conclusion. It's as much about Shakespeare enduring, I think, as it is about this monument to the loved one, which the sonnet is supposed to represent. So now we'll move on to the two sonnets that are addressed to the dark mistress. One I'm sure you're familiar with. This one probably was not familiar to you. You're probably reading it for the first time. And formally, it's very interesting. If you just look at it, you see all of these pauses in the middle of lines. Usually in Shakespeare, you have this kind of like smooth rhythm to the end of a line, and the line is end stopped. There are a lot of pauses and halts. And the disordered syntax and the sense of things being out of control, I think, is really reflected in that. I'm going to read it, and then we'll talk about some of these formal features. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have, extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. So you probably got a sense that as I was reading it, how difficult it is just to read it, the way that it's punctuated, the syntax, the diction, and the sound of it. It is, the typical Shakespearean rhyme scheme, and the meter is pentameter, and he's going to great extent to keep the formal part of the presentation in control. You can see he has collapsed these words so that he could make this a pentameter line. Right, the expense, that's one syllable there, and so there's a show of control that's happening in the formal presentation, which sort of is not mirrored in what he's saying within the poem. And you probably get a sense that the theme, or one of the primary themes, is lust, right? He's making some kind of commentary on lust. And he repeats reason here a couple of times. And so this kind of gets back to that reason and passion conflict that is presented in the reading notes for Christopher Marlowe's Tragical History of Dr. Faustus. So this conflict between reason and passion is something that the Elizabethans are very concerned about, and it seems to be something that the speaker is reflecting on here. We said this is addressed to the dark mistress. It is explicitly sexual, and you might not catch it at first, but let's sort of just break this down, this first stanza, this first quatrain. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. And till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. And so right in the first line, we have a pun, and you might not catch this at first, but the expense of spirit and a waste of shame.
And so there's kind of this economic metaphor that's happening here. Something's being wasted, and this is what the word waste, W-A-S-T-E, means. But this is also sort of a clever way of saying intercourse, the expense of spirit, spirit being a sort of reference to semen, in a waste of shame. And waste, here he's punning on the word waste, the physical body part waste, W-A-I-S-T. And so there's this notion in the early modern period that, you know, every time you ejaculate, you're killing yourself, you're dying, and so they called it the little death. And so the idea is a little bit of your spirit is depleted every single time you have an orgasm, and so it's a waste of shame, though. And so presumably this is the dark mistress that he's talking about, and it sort of speaks to the speaker's self-loathing. He doesn't like feeling this way. And then, so this is lust in action. But until it becomes action, what is lust? It's perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, and not to trust. And so it's all of these things that are dangerous if we look into the definition of these words. And I've shown you here, I've marked I've scanned the line a little bit, not fully, but you see that there are these serial spondees where we have hard vowels that are accented, and that is really reinforcing the kind of, you know, passion that the speaker is putting into this, right? He is, you know, he's very distressed by this feeling, by lust. If we look into the next quatrain, enjoyed no sooner but despised straight, right? So as soon as you've achieved your goal, as soon as you've ejaculated, you despised yourself, right? You're full of self-loathing. Past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated, as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad. So he's past reason, he's not in his rational mind, and he's hunting, right? That's what lust drives him to do. And no sooner had, you know, past reason hated as a swallowed bait. And so the idea is that he's the hunter, he's seeking out gratification, but he's also being hunted. And so it's the bait that he swallows. So lust is kind of a predator to the speaker, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. And so, you know, again, it's this idea of being out of reason, being irrational. Passion puts you in that state of anti-reason, or, you know, being a state opposed to reason. He continues this in the last quatrain. Mad in pursuit, and he's talking about madness, and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have, extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed, behind a dream. So what he's saying is that this is a repeated cycle, right? Had, having, and in quest to have. And so there really never is any satisfaction achieved, right? It's always sort of lust is renewed, right? And so he's always in one of these states. So it's blissful at one moment when you prove it, when you realize it, and then once you've realized it, a very woe, right? Something unfortunate, something you regret. And these lines are interesting. Before a joy proposed, behind a dream. And so a joy proposed, something he's imagining, right? And then behind a dream, this sense that, you know, what he had proposed or what he had imagined, it turned out to be a fantasy, right? And yet one that gets renewed, right? Mad in pursuit and in possession. So this is sort of cycle that happens. And then the solution, if we can call it a solution, he doesn't really present one. And this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. And so the world well knows. He's not, you know, explaining anything or any experience that is not familiar. But this idea to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. This is a sort of classical Shakespearean paradox, right? Heaven represents a sort of brief satisfaction that you receive with sexual gratification, and yet immediately, right, plunged into hell, the sense of self-loathing and regret, and the renewal of the whole cycle over again. And so you get a sense of a speaker who's really, you know, not in control of his lust or his passion, or feeling out of control, and full of self-loathing for that, right? Reason is the highest value and the thing that distinguishes man from animal. And so this sense of self-loathing comes from a purely animal nature, and being able to, not being able to control that. And it's really reflected in, interestingly and contradicted at the same time, it's reflected in the sort of uncontrolled feeling of the sonnet. It's full of all these halts and pauses. The lines are fragmented. It seems mad and disordered in the way that the speaker is describing his own experience. But at the same time, look at the rhyme scheme and the perfect, pentameter line. There's a great, effort to achieve formal control here. And so, again, maybe writing is the solution in some respects to the problem that the speaker is proposing. He achieves some sort of control or mastery by writing it down and putting it in form. And yet, the theme of the poem is the lack of control, the madness that comes with passion. What's interesting too, again, is that, the sonnet is supposed to be addressing someone. And clearly the dark mistress is not idealized in any way. And the sonnet is much more about the speaker and the self-loathing that he feels as a result of his feelings for the dark mistress and his inability, to resist his impulses and his passions with regard to her. But there's really nothing mentioned about her at all. And so if we were talking about whether it's conventional or not, formally, yes, very conventional. But it doesn't idealize her in any way. And it really is not about the kind of transcendent love that you normally see in sonnets. It's about lust, which is something different. We're only going to take a couple of minutes here on the last sonnet, Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. I'm sure that you've heard it before. It comes immediately after the one that we just read, and the tone couldn't be more different. It's playful, it's humorous, and it is about the dark mistress. And so I'm just going to read it. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, and in some perfume is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. And so this is sort of the anti-Petrarchan sonnet. It's sort of throwing all the conventions about the address of the speaker to the loved one out the window, really. And it's meant to be funny. It's meant to be humorous. It is perfect iambic pentameter. So again, great control. And you can see it has that kind of fluidity and flow in the lines that we expect in Shakespeare, nothing like Sonnet 129 that we just read. And we could break it down. But mostly it's just the Petrarchan conventions, the typical forms of address that you expect to see. He's basically invoking all of those, right? Her eyes aren't like the sun. This is what we remember from Petrarch, right? She doesn't have coral red lips or white skin, and her hair is like black wires, right? Her breath isn't all that great. He talks about, she doesn't glide like an angel. She doesn't walk like a goddess. And she treads on the ground. And so he's invoking all of those things that Petrarch says about Laura in the first sonnet that we looked at. His solution, though, is an interesting one. It's kind of like a backhanded compliment. He says, "And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare." And so we could ask what he means by this, my love as rare. Is he saying that it's rare because of all of these things, like in spite of her, lack of perfection or idealized beauty that we expect to see, he still loves her, and so that's why it's rare? Or is it just rare, meaning that it's profound? So there's different ways that these lines could be read, but it's sort of the classic anti-Petrarchan sonnet. We would definitely say, in some respects, it's traditional. It's addressing a woman, and it's talking about love. But in every other respect, it's anti-convention. It's sort of invoking the conventions only to make fun of them.